It was the perfect setting for a drama king, a masquerade ball at the Royal Opera House. But when the music stopped and a pistol shot rang out, King Gustav III wasn't acting. Assassinated by his own nobles, his death was as controversial as his life. Rumors of a sexless marriage, handsome male favorites, and a scandalous arrangement to produce an heir involving a third man. Was Sweden's so-called gay king killed for his politics, or was he a victim of the hatred toward his forbidden bedroom secrets? Gustav's world was a stage of his own construction. Most monarchs in the 18th century viewed their power as a divine right, a heavy burden placed upon them by God. Gustav viewed the throne differently. To him, the throne was a prop. The crown was a costume. The court was an ensemble cast, and Sweden itself was simply a captive audience that needed to be entertained. This wasn't just a metaphor for him, it was a literal interpretation of reality. He didn't distinguish between the applause of a theater crowd and the loyalty of a subject. In his mind, if he played the role of the king convincingly enough, if he hit his marks, delivered his lines with passion, and wore the most magnificent costume, then he would be the king. But beneath the velvet and the gold, there was a profound emptiness. The historical drama now descends into a psychological thriller. Gustav was a man obsessed with mirrors, yet he was terrified of what he might see if he looked too closely. He was a man who needed to be looked at constantly, largely because he didn't quite believe he existed when no one was watching. This deep-seated narcissism wasn't born of arrogance, as his enemies claimed, but of a frantic insecurity. He was a performer who was terrified of the silence that comes when the curtain falls. The royal morning routine, the levee, revealed more about the nature of his power than any official decree. In the late 1700s, the levee, the act of the king waking up and getting dressed, was a public ceremony. But for Gustav, it was a transformation. He would spend hours, literally hours, sitting before his vanity table. This wasn't simple grooming, it was construction. He was obsessed with his appearance, yet he was not a naturally handsome man. He had a slightly crooked body, a face that was expressive but odd, with large, searching eyes. To compensate, he practically painted a new face on top of the old one. He would slather his skin in the thick, toxic, white lead makeup popular at the time, turning his face into a pale, emotionless mask. He would rouge his cheeks to simulate the flush of youth and health he rarely felt. He fussed over wigs, ribbons, and medals with the intensity of a stage manager checking props before opening night. He didn't just dress to be presentable, he dressed to be a spectacle. He loved silks that shimmered under candlelight, diamonds that caught the eye from across a room. He once famously designed a national costume for Sweden, a black and red Renaissance-style outfit, and forced his entire court to wear it, essentially turning his nobility into extras in his own period drama. This obsession with aesthetics was his way of controlling the world. If he could control how things looked, perhaps he could control how they were. He spent more time sketching designs for court dresses than he did reading economic reports. He would interrupt meetings of the state council to discuss the fabric of a sash or the lighting of a ballroom. To the rugged Lutheran generals and stoic noblemen of Sweden, men who valued martial strength and simplicity, this behavior was baffling. It was offensive. They saw a king who was treating the ancient, blood-soaked crown of Sweden like a toy in a dress-up box. They whispered that he was effeminate, a dangerous accusation in that era, coded language for being weak, unnatural, and unfit to lead men. But Gustav didn't care about their whispers, or perhaps he just acted as if he didn't hear them. He was too busy building his temple. In 1782, he inaugurated the Royal Swedish Opera House. For most kings, an opera house is a nice cultural addition, a place to visit on weekends. For Gustav, it was the center of the universe. He didn't just build it, he poured his soul into it. He believed, with a fervor bordering on religious mania, that the theater was the true school of the nation. He wrote plays himself, endless, melodramatic, historical epics, where his ancestors were always the heroes and the dialogue was always lofty. He would personally direct the actors, showing them how to walk, how to die, how to project their voices. There are stories of the King of Sweden, the ruler of the realm, jumping onto the stage during rehearsals, pushing actors aside to demonstrate how a real king should stand. The irony, of course, was lost on him. He was acting out the role of a king on stage because he felt so uncomfortable being a king in real life. The opera house became his bunker. Outside, the world was messy. The Russian Empire was threatening the borders. The harvest was failing. The nobility was plotting. But inside the opera house, Gustav was God. He could control the lighting. He could write the script. He could ensure that the hero always won and the audience always clapped. This retreat into fantasy created a dangerous social mask. In public, Gustav was charming, witty, and dazzling. He spoke French better than he spoke Swedish. He was the life of the party, the charmer on the throne. He could talk to anyone, from a foreign ambassador to a common soldier, and make them feel like the most important person in the world. It was a dazzling performance, but it was just that, a performance. Those who got close to him noticed something chilling. His eyes never quite met yours. His laughter was a little too loud, a little too practiced. He was like a beautiful clockwork doll that mimicked human connection perfectly, but felt nothing. This friction between the man and the role began to grind away at the foundations of his reign. The nobility, the class that was supposed to support him, began to despise him with a visceral intensity. They didn't just hate his policies, they hated him. They hated his perfumes, his French manners, his obsession with opera. They felt he was mocking them. Sweden was a country of iron and timber, of hard winters and harder men. And here was their king, fluttering about in silk, worried about whether the tenor hit the high C. They viewed his lifestyle not as a quirk, but as a moral rot, and the rot was spreading. Gustav's narcissism led him to surround himself with yes-men, beautiful young favorites who flattered his vanity and shielded him from the harsh truths of governance. He created a bubble of adoration, a court that was an echo chamber of his own delusions. He pushed away the experienced statesmen, the grumpy old advisors who told him things he didn't want to hear, and replaced them with sycophants who praised his screenplays. He believed he was loved. He believed he was the father of the fatherland. When he walked through the streets of Stockholm, he saw the smiles of the common people who genuinely liked his flair and his attempts to curb the power of the nobility, and he mistook that for universal adoration. He didn't see the knives being sharpened in the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. He didn't understand that by turning politics into a performance, he had turned his political enemies into critics. And critics, when they are pushed too far, don't just write bad reviews. In the brutal world of 18th century politics, they kill the leading man. But the greatest tragedy of Gustav's life wasn't political. It was personal. While he was busy acting the part of the great father of the nation, he was failing miserably at being a husband or a father in his own home. The actor king had a secret, a humiliation so deep it threatened to bring his entire house of cards crashing down. It was a secret that lay in the one place he couldn't direct, the one place where he couldn't hide behind a mask, his own bedroom. The bright lights of the opera house cast long, dark shadows, and it was in these shadows that Gustav's life began to unravel. He could command armies badly. He could build palaces and he could write operas, but he could not do the one thing a king is absolutely required to do. He could not love his wife. And this failure, this intimate physical dysfunction, would lead him to make a decision so bizarre, so scandalous, that it would stain his legacy forever. He had built a fortress of beauty to hide his inadequacy, but the cracks were starting to show. And through those cracks, the world was about to catch a glimpse of the terrified, lonely man hiding inside the royal robes. If the opera house was Gustav's heaven, the royal bedchamber was his hell. It was here, away from the applause and the flickering candlelight of the stage, that the king faced a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. In the public eye, he was the master of ceremonies, the vibrant center of the Swedish universe. In the privacy of his marriage, he was a ghost, absent, cold, and utterly paralyzed. The depth of the coming humiliation was mirrored in the woman sharing this silence. Queen Sophia Magdalena of Denmark was, in every conceivable way, the anti-Gustav. Where he was manic, she was depressive. Where he was a creature of French wit and constant chatter, she was a woman of profound, almost painful shyness. She was deeply religious, conservative, and seemingly carved from the same ice as the Swedish winter. Gustav found her dull. Worse, he found her physically repelling. He famously complained to his friends that she had cold eyes and a stiff manner that killed any desire he might have summoned. But the problem was not merely a clash of personalities. It was something far more primal, and for a king expected to breed far more dangerous. Gustav III, the man who designed dresses and obsessively curated the beauty of his male favorites, possessed a deep-seated, almost phobic aversion to the female body. The whispers in the court were not subtle. They spoke of his intense emotional intimacies with handsome young courtiers. They noted how his eyes would light up when a dashing officer entered the room, and how they would glaze over in the presence of court beauties. Whether this was homosexuality, asexuality, or a complex psychological block born of his own insecurities, the result was the same: impotence. For 9 long years, the royal marriage remained unconsummated. 9 years. In a monarchy, a marriage is not a romantic union. It is a political factory designed to produce a successor. A king who cannot produce an heir is a king who is failing his primary job description. The silence in the bedroom was becoming a roar in the council chambers. The nobility, already suspicious of Gustav, began to smirk. Foreign ambassadors wrote coded letters home, mocking the virgin king. The stability of the Gustavian dynasty was hanging by a thread, threatened not by war, but by the king's inability to perform a basic biological function. By 1775, the pressure had become intolerable. Gustav was desperate. He needed a child. He needed to prove his virility to the world, even if he couldn't prove it to himself. And in his desperation, he conceived of a plan so bizarre, so degrading, that it shattered the sanctity of the monarchy forever. He realized he could not do this alone. He needed a director. He needed a stunt double. He needed a guide. Enter Adolf Fredrik Monk. Monk was the stablemaster, a Finnish nobleman who was everything Gustav was not. He was rugged, confident, and notoriously experienced with women. He had a reputation as a libertine, a man who understood the mechanics of sex in a way Gustav understood the mechanics of a minuet. Gustav didn't just ask Monk for advice over a glass of wine. He invited him into the sanctuary of the marriage bed. What followed is known to history as the Monk affair, a sequence of events so mortifying that it reads like dark satire. The King of Sweden, the absolute monarch, practically begged his stablemaster to teach him how to sleep with his own wife. But it wasn't just verbal instruction. It was physical intervention. The historical accounts of those nights in 1775 are excruciatingly detailed, thanks in part to Monk himself, who later spoke of his role with a mixture of pride and indiscretion. The scene was set not with romance, but with the clinical anxiety of a medical procedure. Monk was brought into the royal bedroom while the king and queen lay in bed, stiff and terrified. He was not there to watch, he was there to work. The humiliation was crushing. The king, stripped of his robes and his majesty, trembling with anxiety. The queen, a pious and shy woman, forced to endure the presence of a third man in her most private moments. Monk had to physically guide them. He had to touch the king, touch the queen, positioning their bodies like mannequins, instructing them on movement and anatomy. It was a physical instruction that blurred the lines of decency. At times, it bordered on a ménage à trois. Monk was not just a spectator, he was a participant, the necessary bridge between two people who were physically repulsed by the act of intimacy. There are darker whispers, never proven but widely believed at the time, that Monk did more than just guide. The instruction was so hands-on and the king's incapacity so profound that many believed Monk simply took the king's place. They whispered that Gustav, unable to perform, had stepped back into the shadows of the room, the voyeur in his own life, while Monk did the deed for him. Whether this is true or merely a scandalous exaggeration, the emotional reality remains the same. Gustav had ceded his manhood to another man. He had turned the conception of his heir into a spectator sport. And it worked, or so it seemed. In 1778, the canons of Stockholm fired a salute. Queen Sophia Magdalena had given birth to a son, the future Gustav IV Adolf. The king was jubilant. He paraded the infant prince before the court, playing the role of the proud father with all the theatrical flair he could muster. He lavished titles and gifts upon Monk, giving him a diamond-encrusted watch and promoting him to high office. It was a performance of gratitude that only fueled the fire. The court did not cheer, they gossiped. The timeline was too perfect. The intimacy between Monk and the royal couple was too well known. The baby, some noted cruelly, looked nothing like the king. The joy of the birth was instantly poisoned by the Monk rumor. The entire nation seemed to believe that the crown prince was a bastard, the son of the stablemaster. The queen, who had endured the ultimate degradation to do her duty, was broken by the rumors. She had submitted to the grotesque arrangement out of obedience, only to be branded an adulteress by the public. She withdrew completely. The brief, bizarre alliance between king and queen dissolved into bitter estrangement. They lived the rest of their lives in separate wings of the palace, meeting only for ceremonial occasions. Two strangers bound by a shared secret and a shared shame. For Gustav, the success of the Monk affair was a hollow victory. He had his heir, yes. He had secured the succession. But the cost was his dignity. He knew what the court whispered when his back was turned. He saw the knowing looks when he held his son. He was the cuckold king, the man who needed help to be a man. This sexual humiliation became the engine of his tragedy. A man who feels powerless in bed will often seek absolute power everywhere else. Gustav threw himself into his public role with a renewed, almost manic intensity. If he could not command desire, he would command obedience. If he could not be a lover, he would be a god. He retreated further into his fantasy world. He spent more money on the opera. He designed more elaborate uniforms. He tightened his grip on the government, pushing through laws that gave him absolute authority, alienating the nobility even further. He was trying to drown out the memory of those nights in the bedroom, with the noise of applause and the thunder of cannons. But you cannot outrun your own reflection. The monk affair had cracked the foundation of the monarchy. It stripped away the divine mystery of the king. To his subjects, he was no longer God's anointed. He was just a confused, deviant man playing dress-up. And as the whispers grew louder, turning from mockery to hatred, the stage was being set for a different kind of tragedy, one where the blood would be real and the director would lose control of the final act. If the bedroom was the site of his deepest shame, the public stage became his instrument of vengeance. After the humiliation of the monk affair, Gustav did not retreat into modesty. He radicalized his kingship. He seemed to decide that if he could not be a husband or a biological father in the traditional sense, he would become something far greater, a living deity. The psychological shift was terrifying in its intensity. He began to blur the lines between the monarch and the state, crafting a persona that was no longer just royal, but celestial. This was no longer about vanity. It was about political survival through spectacle. Gustav realized that his legitimacy had been cracked by the whispers about his son's parentage. To seal those cracks, he needed to blind the court with brilliance. The daily rituals at the palace ceased to be mere grooming sessions and transformed into acts of worship. He surrounded himself with a barrier of etiquette, so rigid, so complex, that it elevated him miles above his subjects. He wasn't just hiding his aging face or his insecurities. He was projecting an image of the Sun King, reborn in the freezing north. Every ribbon, every medal, and every gesture was calculated to assert dominance. He was trying to prove that he was not the weak man who needed help in his bedchamber, but the divinely appointed ruler of the Swedish Empire. But a god needs a temple, and the royal palace was filled with the ghosts of his failures. So he turned his obsession outward, weaponizing culture as a tool of the state. The opera house became his parliament. While his ministers worried about the famine and the collapsing economy, Gustav was busy orchestrating a cultural revolution. He believed that by importing the grandeur of Rome and the elegance of Paris, he could rewrite the soul of the Swedish nation. He poured the dwindling national treasury not into infrastructure or the navy, but into a desperate bid for immortality through art. He appointed himself the Grand Master of this new reality. He wrote plays that were not merely entertainment, but heavy-handed propaganda. In his scripts, the kings of Sweden were always misunderstood geniuses, betrayed by ungrateful nobles but loved by the people, a transparent attempt to brainwash his audience into accepting his absolute rule. He micromanaged the actors with a manic energy, screaming at them to project more nobility, more power, effectively trying to direct his own legacy in real time. It was a delusion of grandeur on a massive scale. Inside the theater, he could force the ending to be happy. He could force the hero to triumph. It was a narcotic escape from the messy, uncontrollable reality of governing a fractured country. However, this retreat into fantasy came at a catastrophic political cost. It widened the chasm between the king and the men who actually held the sword of state, the ancient warrior nobility. These men, forged in the iron traditions of Charles XII, looked at Gustav's court with a mixture of horror and contempt. They did not see a cultural renaissance. They saw moral decay. They saw a king who preferred the company of sycophantic poets and beautiful young favorites, men like Armfelt, who rose to power on a tide of flattery over the council of experienced generals. The friction turned into a fire with the introduction of the national costume. What Gustav intended as a unifying aesthetic was received as a badge of servitude. By forcing the proud, independent aristocracy to don his specific black and red uniform, he was symbolically stripping them of their individuality and their ancient rights. He was turning the fierce lords of Sweden into liveried servants, mere extras in his grand production. It was a visual declaration of absolutism. To the nobles, wearing that suit was not a fashion statement. It was a daily humiliation, a constant reminder that they were trapped in the king's fever dream. Gustav was blind to the lethality of this rising hatred because he had successfully isolated himself from the truth. He had purged the council of dissenting voices, creating a mirror court that reflected only his own brilliance. When he asked for advice, he received applause. When he made mistakes, he was told they were strokes of genius. He began to mistake the silence of the nobility for submission, unaware that silence is often the sound of a weapon being loaded. The tragedy of the narcissist is that he eventually believes the script is real life. Desperate to silence the rumors of his impotence once and for all, Gustav reached for the ultimate prop of masculinity: war. He launched a campaign against Russia not because of a strategic threat, but because he wanted to play the role of the warrior king like his ancestors. He designed the uniforms, he painted the scenes, but he forgot that war uses real blood, not stage paint. When the campaign stalled and the supplies ran out, the illusion shattered. The officers at Angela didn't just mutiny, they broke the fourth wall. They refused to die for a play. And for the first time, the actor king stood on stage. And the audience didn't just refuse to clap, they began to march against him. By the late 1780s, the Gustavian era had become a gilded cage. The treasury was empty, drained by the war, and the endless cultural projects. The people were hungry. The nobility was murderous. But inside the palace, the music played on. The balls became more extravagant. The masquerades more frequent. It was a fever dream of denial. Gustav was like a man dancing on the edge of a volcano, convinced that if he just danced beautifully enough, the lava wouldn't dare touch him. He had spent his life building a world of beautiful illusions, believing that beauty was a form of protection. He thought that by bringing culture and light to Sweden, he would be loved. He didn't realize that to the men in the shadows, men with cold eyes and iron convictions, he was just a decadent clown who had stayed on stage too long. They were tired of the play. They were tired of the costumes. And they were beginning to realize that the only way to bring the curtain down was to remove the lead actor. The tragedy was moving toward its climax. The king had alienated his wife, his parliament, his army, and his nobility. He stood alone, surrounded only by paid flatterers and the ghosts of his own ambition. He had turned his life into an opera, forgetting that, in a true opera, the hero usually dies in the final act. The stage was set, the orchestra was tuning up, and in the dark corners of Stockholm, the assassins were loading their pistols with rusty nails. By the spring of 1792, the air in Stockholm was thick enough to choke on. It was not just the fog rolling off the freezing waters of the Baltic. It was the suffocating atmosphere of hatred. The king had pushed too far. He had drained the treasury, insulted the pride of the nobility, and ruled like a despot in silk stockings. The actor king was no longer amusing. He was intolerable. In the candlelit drawing rooms of the aristocracy, the whispers had stopped, replaced by the grim silence of men who had made a decision. The script had been written, but this time, Gustav was not the author. The conspiracy was not small. It wasn't a lone madman. It was a cabal of high-ranking officers and noblemen who viewed the assassination not as murder, but as tyrannicide, a patriotic duty to save Sweden from a man they considered a ruinous eccentric. At the center of this web sat Jacob Johann Ankerstrom. He was the perfect antagonist for Gustav. Where the king was soft, fluid, and theatrical, Ankerstrom was rigid, fanatical, and burning with a cold Lutheran righteousness. He hated Gustav's spending, he hated his morals, and he hated his face. He viewed himself as an instrument of divine justice, and the weapon he chose was a testament to that hatred. Ankerstrom did not load his pistols with standard lead bullets. That would have been too clean, too honorable. He loaded them with a mixture of jagged scrap iron, rusty nails, and chopped lead. This wasn't a load designed to kill instantly. It was designed to shred, to tear, and to cause an agonizing, festering death. It was a weapon of pure malice. The date was set for March 16th, 1792. The location was inevitable, the Royal Opera House. The conspirators knew their king. They knew he couldn't resist a masquerade ball. It was his natural habitat, the only place where the lines between reality and fantasy were blurred, enough for him to feel comfortable. To kill him there, amidst the music and the masks, was a grim, poetic justice. They would bring the curtain down on his own stage. On the evening of the ball, Gustav received a warning. An anonymous letter was delivered to him while he was dining with his favorites. It was explicit. It warned him that a plot was afoot and begged him not to attend the masquerade. A normal man, a prudent ruler, would have stayed in his secure palace. But Gustav was not a normal man. He read the note, laughed, and tossed it aside. To hide would be to admit fear. To hide would be to break character. He had spent his life playing the role of the fearless, enlightened monarch. He wasn't about to change the script now. He famously remarked to his terrified friend, Count Essen, "If I listened to every scare, I would never leave my room." He dressed for the evening with his usual meticulous care, but there was an arrogance in his costume choice. He wore a domino, a large black taffeta cape, over a suit of shimmering gray silk. On his chest, blazing against the dark fabric, was the grand silver star of the Order of the Seraphim, and beneath the cape, the red sash of royalty. He wore a white mask that covered the upper half of his face, but it was a disguise designed to be penetrated. He wanted to be recognized. He wanted to walk through the crowd of his enemies and show them he was unafraid. He was a target walking into a firing squad, wearing a neon sign. When the king arrived at the opera house, the party was already in full swing. The great stage had been converted into a ballroom floor, packed with hundreds of revelers in every conceivable costume. The air was hot and smelled of sweat, expensive French perfume, and wax from the thousands of candles burning in the chandeliers. The music was loud, a driving rhythm that masked the sound of footsteps and whispering voices. Gustav stood in his private box for a moment, looking down at the swirling mass of people. It was his creation. The building, the music, the costumes, it was all his vision brought to life. He turned to Count Essen and said, "Look, is it not beautiful? They are all here." He didn't know that among the dancers, men with loaded pistols were watching his box, waiting for him to descend. And descend he did. He took Essen's arm and walked down to the floor. He moved through the crowd with his distinct, slightly mincing gait, stopping to exchange pleasantries, playing the charmer on the throne one last time. But the atmosphere on the floor was wrong. The crowd was too dense. A group of men in black capes and white masks began to drift toward him, moving with a coordinated purpose that cut against the flow of the dance. They were like wolves circling a stag. They surrounded him near the wings of the stage. It was a trap in the theatrical sense. He was hemmed in by actors in a play he didn't know he was in. The conspirators separated the king from his guards. The music seemed to swell drowning out the warning cries of his few loyal friends. Ankerstrom moved in from behind. He was close enough to smell the king's pomade. He leaned in, intimate as a lover, and whispered the code phrase that signaled the attack. Accounts differ on the exact words, but the most enduring version is the chillingly polite French greeting. Bonjour, beau masque. Good day, fine mask. It was the cue. Ankerstrom pressed the muzzle of his pistol against the king's back, just above the hip, on the left side. He didn't hesitate, he pulled the trigger. The sound was muffled by the heavy fabric of the cape and the din of the orchestra. It sounded less like a gunshot and more like the pop of a champagne cork or a falling tray. But the impact was devastating. The charge of rusty nails and scrap iron tore through the gray silk, shattered the king's ribs, and ripped into his internal organs. Gustav didn't scream. He didn't fall immediately. In that split second of agony, his instinct was to perform. He staggered, gripped the shoulder of Count Essen, and gasped, "Je suis blessé." I am wounded. Even with metal shredding his insides, he delivered his line in French, the language of the court, the language of drama. Then chaos erupted. The king's knees gave way, and he began to slide to the floor, his gray suit rapidly turning a dark, slick crimson. The conspirators, realizing the deed was done, immediately began to shout, "Fire! Fire!" It was a tactic to create a stampede, to cover their escape in the confusion. The ballroom exploded into panic. Women in expansive hoop skirts screamed and fainted. Men shoved and trampled each other to get to the doors. The music faltered and died, replaced by the roar of terror. But amidst the stampede, the king's guards, the few who were loyal, reacted with military precision. They slammed the great doors of the opera house shut. The order rang out, "No one leaves, the king is shot." The trap that had caught the king now caught his assassins. The beautiful ball had instantly transformed into a crime scene. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of fear. Gustav was lifted from the floor. He was bleeding profusely, the pain unimaginable, yet he remained lucid. He looked at the chaos around him, the screaming guests, the blood on the parquet floor, the masks that had slipped to reveal terrified faces, and he seemed almost detached, observing the scene like a director watching a tragedy unfold. He was carried back to the royal palace on a makeshift stretcher, leaving a trail of blood from the opera house he loved to the home he hated. The journey back was a nightmare, but Gustav bore it with a stoicism that surprised everyone. He was playing the role of the martyr now. He didn't weep. He gave orders. He asked about the safety of his son. He forgave his enemies before he even knew their names. It was a performance of supreme will. Back in the palace, the surgeons cut away the blood-soaked clothes. The wound was catastrophic. The rusty nails and iron scrap had done exactly what Ankerstrom intended. They had created a dirty, jagged wound that 18th century medicine had no hope of cleaning. Infection was inevitable. It wasn't the bullet that would kill him, it was the rot. For 13 days, Gustav lay in his state bed, dying by inches. But even his deathbed was a stage. He refused to let the court see him writhe in pain. He received visitors, dictated letters, and organized a regency government. He spoke with a calm, philosophical air, modeling himself on the death of great Roman emperors. He tried to craft the narrative of his own demise, turning a brutal political murder into a saintly sacrifice. Outside the palace, the city was in shock. The police hunted down the conspirators one by one. Ankerstrom was arrested, identified by the pistols he had dropped on the ballroom floor. He confessed with pride, showing no remorse. He believed he had saved Sweden. But in the quiet of the royal bedroom, the actor king was finally running out of lines. The infection spread, fever consumed him, and the white makeup could no longer hide the gray pallor of death. The mask was finally slipping. He had built a life on illusions, on the belief that if he created enough beauty, he could keep the darkness at bay. But the darkness had found him in the center of his own light, wearing a mask just like his. On March 29th, 1792, the performance ended. Gustav III died. He was 46 years old. The king was dead, but the final curtain call, the judgment of history, was just beginning. And as the news spread across Europe, the world was left to wonder, was this the tragic end of a hero or the just execution of a tyrant? The answer, like everything in Gustav's life, depended entirely on which mask you were looking at. The death of the lead actor usually signals the end of the play, but in the case of Gustav III, the drama didn't stop when his heart did. In fact, the aftermath of his assassination turned into a spectacle that rivaled anything he had ever staged at the opera house. While the king lay in state, surrounded by the weeping poets and artists whose careers he had funded, the city of Stockholm turned its attention to the man who had pulled the trigger. Jacob Johan Ankerstrom became the dark reflection of the king's light, a villain so perfect for the role that the public couldn't look away. Ankerstrom had not tried to run. He had been arrested the morning after the ball, identified easily by the unique pistols he had dropped on the ballroom floor, weapons that were traced back to a gunsmith who knew him. When the police came for him, he didn't deny it. He puffed out his chest and declared he had done it to save the country from a tyrant. He expected to be hailed as a liberator, a Swedish Brutus who had slain Caesar. Instead, he found himself the star of a very different kind of performance, a medieval execution in the Age of Enlightenment. The government, terrified that the assassination was the start of a French Revolution-style uprising, decided to make an example of Ankerstrom that would terrify the population into submission. His punishment was designed to be a theater of pain. For 3 consecutive days, he was dragged to different squares in Stockholm. He was chained to a scaffold, stripped to the waist, and flogged publicly while thousands watched. The enlightened society that Gustav had tried to build dissolved instantly into a bloodthirsty mob. They jeered and threw filth at the man who had killed their father. On the final day, Ankerstrom was taken to the execution site. In a gruesome ritual, his right hand, the hand that had pulled the trigger, was chopped off while he was still alive. Only then was he beheaded. It was a brutal, ugly end, devoid of the silk and romance that Gustav had wrapped his life in. It was the raw, violent reality that the king had spent 46 years trying to ignore. The actor king had died in a masquerade. His killer died in a slaughterhouse. But what of the legacy Gustav left behind? What happened to the desperate gamble he had made in the royal bedroom years earlier? The son he had gone to such humiliating lengths to conceive, Gustav IV Adolf, did inherit the throne. The monk affair had worked in a biological sense. The dynasty continued, but history has a cruel sense of irony. The boy who grew up in the shadow of the actor king hated everything his father stood for. Gustav IV Adolf was a serious, dour, and deeply religious young man. He despised the theater. He despised the French manners and the makeup. He looked at his father's extravagance with disgust. When he came of age, he didn't try to emulate the Gustavian son. He tried to extinguish it. He closed the opera house, the very temple his father had died in. He banished the actors and the dancers. He tore down the frivolous decorations of the palace. It was a rejection so complete it felt personal. It was as if he knew, deep in his bones, the shameful secret of his own conception, and he spent his entire reign trying to be the opposite of the man who might not have been his father at all. And in the ultimate twist of fate, The sacrifice was for nothing. Gustav IV Adolf was a disastrous ruler. He lacked his father's charm and his political instincts. In 1809, after losing Finland to Russia in a catastrophic war, he was deposed in a coup d'etat, not by an assassin's bullet, but by the very officers and nobles his father had alienated. He was exiled from Sweden and died a lonely, forgotten man in a Swiss tavern. The Gustavian bloodline, secured through such pain and scandal, was swept off the throne within a generation. The actor king's greatest production, his heir, was a flop. However, political failure is not the only measure of a life. While Gustav failed to create a stable dynasty, he succeeded in something perhaps more enduring. He created a national identity. Walk through Stockholm today or visit any antique shop in Europe, and you will see his name. The Gustavian style, that unique blend of French elegance and Swedish restraint, of pale gray woods and neoclassical lines, is still the defining aesthetic of Sweden. He didn't just build buildings, he exported a vision of Swedish beauty to the world. He founded the Swedish Academy, the institution that today awards the Nobel Prize in Literature. He believed that the Swedish language was capable of greatness, and he forced his court to speak it and his writers to write in it. Before Gustav, Swedish was considered a peasant tongue, unfit for high art. After him, it was the language of poets. He was a tyrant, yes, and a narcissist, but he was a tyrant who loved art more than war. In a history book filled with kings who burned down cities, there is something strangely redeeming about a king who went bankrupt building opera houses. But the most fitting epilogue to Gustav's life comes from the world of opera itself. Decades after his death, the story of the actor king caught the attention of the Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi. Verdi saw in Gustav's life the perfect ingredients for a masterpiece: a forbidden love, a masked ball, a prophecy of death, and a dramatic assassination. He wrote Un ballo in maschera, a masked ball, intended to be a direct retelling of Gustav's murder. Yet even in death, Gustav couldn't escape the censors. The Italian authorities were horrified by the idea of showing a king being murdered on stage. It was too dangerous, too revolutionary. They forced Verdi to change the setting. Sweden became Boston. King Gustav became Ricardo, the governor of Boston. The conspirators became rebels. The story was twisted and turned until it was barely recognizable as history. For years, audiences watched a baritone sing the role of a colonial governor, unaware they were watching the ghost of the Swedish king. It wasn't until the 20th century that opera houses began to restore the original setting. Now, when the curtain rises on Un ballo in maschera, the tenor steps out in the gray silk suit, the star of the seraphim on his chest, and sings his final aria while dying on the floor of the Stockholm Opera House. Gustav would have loved it. He would have loved the music, the drama, the applause. He would have loved that people were still buying tickets to see him die 200 years later. He finally got what he always wanted. He became a character in a play that never closes. The final judgment of Gustav III remains as fractured as his identity. It is easy to dismiss Gustav III as a vain fool, a man who fiddled while Stockholm burned. It is easy to mock the makeup and the corsets, but look closer at the two images we started with, the war criminal and the hero. The truth is, he was both, and he was neither. He was a frightened man who found himself cast in a role he was terrified to play, the absolute monarch of a struggling nation. He didn't have the martial strength of his ancestors. He didn't have the sexual confidence of a typical king. He didn't have the support of his peers. All he had was his imagination. So he used it. He built a mask of competence out of silk and rhetoric. He built a mask of virility out of a stablemaster's assistance. He built a mask of bravery out of a masquerade costume. The tragedy of Gustav III isn't that he was an actor. It's that the audience refused to suspend their disbelief. They saw the strings. They saw the grease paint. They refused to clap. But in his final moments, bleeding out on the floor of the opera house, Gustav didn't break character. He didn't scream for his mother or beg for mercy. He delivered his line, "I am wounded," with the poise of a professional. We're all actors in some way, wearing our own masks to work, to parties, to our own bedrooms. We project confidence when we are scared. We smile when we are angry. Gustav III just did it on a grander scale, with higher stakes. He reminds us that sometimes the mask is the only thing holding the man together, and when the mask is finally shattered by a bullet made of rusty nails, what remains is not just a dead monarch, but the terrifying vulnerability of a man who spent his life begging the world to look at him while praying that no one would ever truly see him. The actor king took his final bow in 1792, but the echo of his performance still lingers in the cold northern air. The opera house was torn down by his son, but a new one was built in its place. The dynasty fell, but the culture survived. And somewhere in the dark, silent archive of history, amidst the dry treaties and the dusty maps, Gustav III still shines, a glittering, tragic, impossible figure, forever waiting for the applause that was always just a little bit too quiet.